Hi everyone, welcome to codeAYD. Today in our Making iOS Apps in Swift series, we'll be looking at an introduction to Xcode and specifically the Xcode layout, so what all these buttons mean all over the screen. In the last video we created an Xcode project, so if you haven't watched that, make sure you check that out. Now that we're in the Xcode project, we want to look at the layout. So the main thing we're going to start off is on this side over here. It's pretty simple. There's different tabs at the top. This is my files, and then we have working copies, which is like source control, and we have all sorts of different things over here. We can find things in the project, we can see our errors. For now, we just want to be on the first one, which is our files. The first file you see is your app, so it'll be the name of your app. And it's not actually a file, but it's just a representation of your Xcode project. So you want to click My First App, or whatever your name is for your app, and you're going to go to Targets, and then you'll be on the screen we're on here. So this is just a basic page where we can set up different settings for our app, mainly things like which modes we're going to have for landscape and all that. You can play around with all this, but don't play around too much. There's then a few tabs at the top, but that's pretty much all it is for this one. We'll do this later on with making settings within our apps. Then we have folders. So folders are really helpful for organizing our project. By default, it creates a folder for us to put everything under, which is good. And then the first thing you'll see in there is app delegate. Now you might open this and think, wow, that's a lot of code. It's really not, and we'll go through it later on so that you can understand what all this is. But the app delegate is code that runs for the entire app. So you can scroll through that and see that there. Just don't mess around with anything yet if you don't know what you're doing. Then the second file you'll see is a viewcontroller.swift. There's not much in here because nothing's happening at the moment, but this is code for our unique view controllers, which we'll also get into later. Then our next one is main.storyboard, and we'll be spending at the start of the course most of our time in here. You can see this might look familiar. This is an iPhone screen, and it might ask you when you go onto it what you want to view it as. Pick any phone that you like. You can also change it later on down here. So I might go iPhone XS Max. There we go. And we're going to design our interface here, which comes later on. But just leave that blank for now. Then we have our assets. So our assets are our images that we use in our app, our icon for our app, and all sorts of other things. We have a launch screen, so what you see in that first 1 or 2 seconds when you press the app button. And then we have our info.plist, which is pretty much what we saw before, but it's in this list kind of a thing. It's called a property list or a plist. We'll go through this later on as well. You can see there's a few things in here. There's not a lot to it. It's just for adding different settings and things, but that's the main layout. You have your files over here, and within each file, you'll start to see things. Now, one button that they've recently added to Xcode, which we'll be using a lot, and it's quite useful, is this button up the top here. So that button is different everywhere across Xcode. When I'm on a storyboard file, like main.storyboard, and I click that, you'll see objects. So these are objects that I can drag onto here. For example, if I drag a label, then I'll have a label, and I'll put that in the middle of my app there. But when I go to my code, you'll see that it instead has snippets. So for example, if I wanted to include a new class, I could put it there. Well, that's what I normally include in a class, but we'll get to all snippets and stuff like that later on. I'll just remove that for now. So that button we need to familiarize ourselves with. We'll be using that a lot. Next to that, you'll see this little segmented control. So I can click this to see my standard editor, but I can also go to an assistant editor, which is where I have 2 editors side by side. So this editor will assist whatever I'm doing over here. That view controller file you saw over here before is actually what's over here now. These two are linked. This is my view controller in the interface, and this is my view controller's code. Then you'll see a third one, which we won't really be using very much. As you can see, it's a bit confusing. That's pretty much what our storyboard is like in code, but we won't be using that one in this course. I'll just put it back to standard editor. Now you'll see this over here. If for any reason your Xcode project looks like this at the moment, don't panic. All you got to do is press the buttons around here and it'll show and hide different views. This is particularly useful on MacBooks where you don't have a lot of screen real estate. You can just play around with those there. The one at the bottom is the console. We'll be using that later on, but you can hide that for now. Try and keep these side two open. Maybe not the files view, but definitely try and keep them if you can, if you have the screen space. So that's our basic layout of Xcode. We have different things over here on the side, which also change for different things I click. So for example, when I click on here, you'll start to see things like this. If I put my mouse there, you'll see that this is the file inspector. So the file I have here, which is the main.storyboard, this is all the information relative to that. Then I have quick help. So for example, if I click on the back view, you'll see quick help for a UI view. When I click on my label, you'll see quick help for a UI label. There we go. Then we have our class inspector over here, where we can start to add different things. We'll be using this later on. And the main one we'll spend most of our time in is the attributes inspector. So for example, if I wanted to change the text of the label, I could say hello. And again, you don't need to know all this at the moment. We'll go more in depth into it later on, but just to show you the layout, we have our different tabs here and there's all the different things underneath them. You can feel free to play around with this, make a little design if you like, perfectly up to you. We have a sizing inspector as well and our outlets inspector. I wouldn't encourage you to play around with this unless you know what you're doing with the outlets. The outlets we'll go into later on, they're very important, but if you get them wrong, the app won't even run. We have here a hierarchy of our view, which you can also close, and if you've lost it, that's fine. There's a button down the bottom here. You want to click that button, and there you go. There's your hierarchy. So our view controller is just a big box, which is pretty much a screen on our app. It can have views within it. So for example, we have a back view, but it'll create all this for you. Here's your views over here. Again, don't need to know this, don't need to stress about it. We'll get more into that later on. Also up the top, no matter where you are in Xcode, you'll see this little segment up here. And it's pretty much just how your project is and where you are in your project. So if I click it, I can actually navigate 2 different files from it. So I'll go to my storyboard from up here instead of from here, which means you can even close that file on the side if you like, the file inspector. It's pretty useless, but if you're running low on space, you can start to do things here. And as you see, I click things around the storyboard, it starts to change them up here. We also have errors up here and warning messages. When I click that, it just puts me over here. So remember we had a segmented control up here before. I can see my build time errors and my runtime errors. This is giving me a warning about my label. It won't look the same on every device. So it's in the center of the screen for the iPhone 10, but if I put it back to some smaller screen, like the SE, you can see it's not in the same spot. We'll get more into that later on, but that's just a little thing to keep in mind. All your errors will be in one spot if ever you get confused. Up the top, we have our normal controls for an app, but we also have our play button. If you hit this, you'll first need to select a simulator. So go to your app and then go to simulator. I'm going to pick iPhone XS Max and I'm going to hit play. That button's called run, not play. But what it'll do is it'll open up an iPhone simulator and on there is the app that you've run. This is pretty exciting and you can use it as a normal iPhone. So I can see it like this. And this is what I said before, you don't need an iPhone in order to run it. I was testing an app in Chinese the other day. So you can change all the settings as you like. You can change the languages. You can play around with it as you like. It's all there ready to go. But play around with that and you can see that your first app, or my first app, is sitting there ready to use. So that's the one we just created and that's a basic layout of Xcode. Thank you.